Well, hi, welcome to the lecture on culture. Culture is a core concept in anthropology, and honestly, you could be at an advanced level of study, and in your defense of a dissertation or in an earlier exam, someone would ask you, what is your understanding of culture? What premises do you hold in your understanding? So it's very important to realize that culture is a key concept in anthropology. For many, many years, not until really the 1940s, uh, anthropologists and others thought of culture as basically as material creations or artifacts. That the artifacts were a window into the mind of people. So consider the artifact as a fossilized idea, though, because the knowledge, the experience, and making whatever you're making is shaped by the culture. The artifact, in effect, reflects the culture. So the idea that culture is behind the artifact, in effect, producing the fossilized idea. Now, culture is very, very powerful. No one is born is innately born with an understanding of culture. Um, it is a process that requires some understanding in terms of its elements. So um, you see here, as I initially point out, that culture is core to anthropology, and what we have to understand is that there are many different theoretical views. In the second half of this lecture, I will be looking at those theoretical ideas that differentiate anthropologists in the way they understand the culture concept, but nonetheless adds a fullness to our understanding of it. So, the first large point is that culture is an essential element of being a human being. Um, you you are absolutely guaranteed to understand your culture just by the process of your uh, fundamental human development. Um, so the first point here is it is learned. Culture is a learned, symbolic, and partially adaptive and ever-changing pattern of behavior shared by members of a group. Um, so again, the key is that no one is born with their culture; they learn it. Many anthropologists understand culture as a major adaptive mechanism uh, of the human species. Culture adaptation has both advantages and disadvantages. We also see that cultures may be thought of as mental templates of or for organizing the world. In this view, cultures are a way of understanding the world, and every culture has a system of classification through which its people identify and organize the aspects of the world that's most important to them. So, many anthropologists spend a lot of time trying to understand culture and comprehend it in terms of its systems of classification. One way to understand this idea of template is to think about the work of Alfred Schutz. He is normally understood as a phenomenological sociologist. Schutz, many years ago, talked about understanding social worlds in reference to social recipes, that we all learned the basic ideas about how we are to behave, interact, and process the world through what he called social recipes. If you're interested, there's a wonderful little book that's many decades old called The Social Construction of Reality by Thomas Luckman and Peter Berger. And it will go through some of Schutz's basic ideas and the phenomenological approach to the interactions, sociologically speaking. Now, again, we talked about material culture. This is very important in so much as it is an insight into the way people think. As I mentioned to you earlier, if they're old pieces of artifact, then we understand them as fossilized ideas. However, material culture today is a way in. Looking at our automobile culture gives you an idea of the importance of the automobile as an important element for social status, for its implications in its impact on our social organization, fragmentation, potential isolation, and also our ability to travel great distances. So you could take this further and further in terms of how materials can tell a lot about a group of people. There are multiple volumes written right now that you can inquire of that talk to the role of modern technology in shaping our societal interaction. And there we have material culture and its intersect with our social societal reality. But cultures are also understood as a way of understanding ourselves, that a culture is a collection of symbols and meanings that permit us to understand others and ourselves. Through culture, we experience our humanity. There's a famous book called The Interpretation of Cultures by Clifford Geertz, and he talks to the idea that culture is a web of significance that gives meaning to our lives and actions. So, again, a major job of an anthropologist is to comprehend the central symbols and meanings of a culture. And in some ways, cultures are systems. That is, they are composed of parts that are related to one another. Changes in one aspect of culture result in changes in another. At the same time, conflict is common in all cultures. And again, I want to add here, as part of the systems idea, is that cultures are collections of norms and guidelines for behavior and values and ideals. And that this system, this collection of ideas, this collection of symbols, they're constantly changing. And change is part of the cultural process. And cultural change can be understood in terms of innovation, invention, and diffusion. Many cultural traits that we think of as being solidly American, for example, are the result of diffusion from other cultures. So that cliche statement that no one is an island is true of cultures as well. Diffusion of ideas has been in operation since the very onset of movement of Homo sapiens and prior to the species Homo sapien, and much to the idea of global archaic globalization, going back to the first group of people leaving Africa, and even within Africa. Well, moving on, let's talk about the uh, more fundamental idea of culture theory, and that is, as I mentioned earlier to you, anthropologists have their own particular um, orientation. You can call them schools. So why theory? And this is the biggest part of anthropology in one sense. How you look at a society um, can give you questions, different types of questions. Some people from the outside looking at culture have called it a social physics. My colleagues would find this a very disturbing terminology, but you might see that floating around in non-specialists in their writings. But nonetheless, it's a way of looking at some of the fundamentals in our interaction symbolically and otherwise. So let me start now with the second part of this lecture, which is now some of the theoretical ideas that are key to understanding culture. So I list here I have a couple of slides with a list that give the baseline ideas related to these different schools. You can see on this slide 4 different orientations. There are many more. I'm only going to point out a few that have particular pertinence, both historically and currently. Now, this idea of evolutionism, this is very big. The idea of social evolutionism, this was, it's pretty well associated with Henry Morgan, and it suggests that all cultures pass through the same development. That is, evolution is unidirectional and leads to a better level of culture. So they use an approach here to apply general theories to specific cases. And this theoretical framework is truly ethnocentric because social evolutionists during the time of Morgan at the turn of the 20th century or late 19th century pretty well understood that cultures evolve one step at a time, all in the same lockstep way, and that they will evolve to what Morgan believed was his own society, and he was writing as an armchair anthropologist from Rochester, New York, evolving to what he believed the state that his society was in. So this is a very powerful concept because, unfortunately, even though it's a 19th century idea, it still has its place. You will see this implicit in foreign policy. You'll see it in journalistic discussions of different societies with comments that are not meant to be derogatory, but people really don't understand the backstory to this cultural approach, in which journalists might say, well, these people are moving, they're moving ahead, they're becoming more modern, etc. And there's this notion that as they reach a closer status to what is comparable to maybe life in America, that they are culturally evolving. You've got to be very careful because there are deep structures in culture that do not necessarily mean that every group of people are going to move into what is understood as a Western society model. Now, a major breakthrough in understanding culture is the notion of American historicism, widely attached to the thoughts of Franz Boas. And Boas was very interested in the uniqueness of individuals and very much understood that there is a diffusion process. And a summary of American historicism is this notion that ethnographic facts must precede the development of any cultural theories. That's why I put on this slide that historicism is very much attached to field work. You must be there with the people to see what the world is, and if you're lucky enough, you can learn something from them about how they see their own life. So he said you got to be on the ground to talk about a particular culture. He also was very clear that culture is composed of traits different from other cultures. It's partially composed of traits that are different. And each culture is unique, and it has its own history. And this is a very important point that must be underscored. But this does not mean that there isn't some diffusion of ideas and interaction among and between people from other societies where they share ideas. But each culture has its own unique history. And it's a very important concept to remember. Remember, if you want to really annihilate a group of people in terms of their presence, you would eliminate their history. I was reading recently about ancient Egypt, and it was very interesting that one individual that we might know, a king in Egypt, Ramses, seems to stand out to us. And in this particular text I was reading, they were suggesting that Ramses understood, and it was the culture of Egypt, that if he took monuments that were built by another king and dug very deeply into their nameplate, the kings would put their names all over whatever columns or other kinds of architectural aspects of their legacy. He thought that if he could put his name over their name, dig very deeply into the stone, and eradicate their name everywhere it was seen, that he could then claim that they never really existed, and eliminate them from both their presence in Egypt and, of course, in their thinking, their future life, the 12 steps to the eternal life. But the notion here is that you eradicate a culture by denying its history. And it's very important when you see this process going on, be aware of that. So again, Boaz was very, very impressed with the idea if you study a society, you get the views of those being studied. This is the way to go about field work, and this is the way to go about studying culture. The next on the list here is functionalism. Now, this is about integrated parts and systems that move toward an equilibrium. And here, again, the anthropologist seeks to understand how parts of a culture contribute to the well-being of an individual and society. And one of the premises that this particular school of functionalism works with, and it's highly associated with Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, is that society is like a biological organism with many interconnected parts. Again, this in a reference to Levi-Strauss, this feels intuitively right. Okay, so if you're not thinking too deeply about the culture concept, you would find yourself saying, well, this makes sense, okay? And the idea is for them, those who like this orientation, is that with high levels of integration, societies tend to be in a state of equilibrium. And a change in one part of the system would bring about a change in another part. So, institutional structures that you see in any society performs functions without which a society could not continue. So, again, the broader question is from this school is how do cultures operate or function? And not only do all cultures have a function, they also relate to one another. And so the notion here is that functions meet the needs of society, and functions also are meeting the needs of the individual. So both Malinowski and Radcliffe-Brown hold two fundamental principles. The notion of a universal function, every part of culture has a function, and functional unity. Culture is an integrated whole composed of a number of interrelated parts. And every culture item has a function. So now the question for you in your mind would be, what are the implications of this theory for understanding social dysfunction, poverty, unemployment, etc.? This is a very conservative orientation to society and culture at large. And what it basically says is that what you see is what you need. And so if you look at poverty, unemployment, these are all functional aspects. They're parts of the culture that has a function and belong there. The next in line here is psychological anthropology. The late Professor Rubenstein, still assigned in his theory course. He and I taught that course, and he took it over. And we talked at length about the use of actually assigning textbooks by Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead to help students understand this particular orientation. Now, it has lost favor because they make such broad concepts or broad ideas about what the cultures might be. Japanese culture is X. So he's come up with these simple equations. However, if you can get beyond that, there's something to be said of trying to understand or explore the relationship between psychological and cultural variables. The broad idea here is that personality is the result of cultural learning, and, quote, universal temperaments are associated with society. So personality should be part and viewed as part of a cultural system. And early anthropologists wanted to relate Freudian Gestalt psychology to culture. Margaret Mead was fascinated with the general topic of emotional disruption that seemed to accompany adolescence in the United States. Is it a biological fate? She went on to wonder, does it occur in all societies? And of course, this is in her infamous book, Coming of Age in Samoa, written in 1928. And Mead reported that the permissive family structure and relaxed sexual patterns among Samoans were responsible for a calm adolescence. And she concluded that emotional turmoil of adolescence in the United States is cultural rather than biologically based. It's a very interesting idea. Ruth Benedict, in her book Pattern of Cultures, and that is the text that the late Professor Rubenstein assigned in his theory course. That book really, since Ruth Benedict was highly literate and a great student of literature in her undergraduate days, then went on to be an excellent writer and anthropologist of import. She really tried to tie the notion of personality and culture in terms of broader based understanding. She's famous for some of her lines like the British or the people of Great Britain are a bellicose people. And she talks about this kind of generalized way of understanding a group. We don't have time in this course to go into depth on her in her book about patterns of culture, but it would be very interesting read if you wanted to see more about how she puts together both literary and other kinds of psychological concepts in relation to culture. Now the next slide will give us 4 more, and again these 8 are just a touch, a little bit of an iceberg here with the tip showing. There's a lot more that we could study in terms of cultural theory. And neo-evolutionism, you could see the neo in front of the evolution, this is where culture equals energy times technology. Great proponent of this is Leslie White. He's trying to argue that cultural evolution is caused by advancing levels of technology and a culture's increasing capacity to capture energy. This was advanced by White in 1959. And you could see that he's very much influenced by his times post-World War II and increasing technologies and ideas about energy. Cultures evolved, he said, in direct proportion to their capacity, as I implied earlier, to harness energy. And culture is shaped by environmental conditions. And through culture, human populations continuously adapt to a techno-environmental condition. And technological factors shape culture. And he de-emphasized individual factors. Structuralism, the greatest proponent of this would, or a name attached to this, could be Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French structuralist. He's saying that the human culture is shaped by binary opposition of mind, that there's a fundamental code of mind. You might find him in a book that would also include the writings of Piaget, for example, as a theory of mind. And he said he concentrates on what happens at the unconscious level. And one of his important ideas, and again, this is someone that I understand from James Boone, a professor where I had studied, who was a significant interpreter of Lévi-Strauss. Professor Boone would argue that you'd have to read French structuralist writings, particularly Strauss's writings, in French if you really wanted to understand them. It's an interesting idea. Lévi-Strauss was a trickster at some point. He actually wrote in one of his books a definition of his understanding of myth and culture, and he put it into an equation, and it was somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek joke, and people said, well, if you had read it in French, you would understand that it was a bit of some comic relief in his writing. There were people around the world trying feverishly to unpack this particular equation. So anyway, So one of the concepts that he's very much interested in, and you can see we can move through this very idea of binary opposition and the code of mind, he wants to really now take us to myth. And he wants to talk about myth as resolving, now not myth as falsehood, but myth as a set of stories that resolves the major oppositions of life. So he would, if we were thinking about this, you could think about this. What are the major oppositions of life? Well, life versus death. There's one, okay? And he would argue to you that it's resolved by a mythology surrounding resurrection um, uh, and other myths that have this kind of common theme. Again, back to my Egyptian example, you know, there are 12 steps, and all of the needs in the temples of the kings to make it to the afterlife, because this life was one piece, but the eternal life was something else, and those tombs were prepared in a way that allowed those kings to be guaranteed an eternal life. So there's structures in people's thoughts that help them. Male versus female, he says in one of his texts, is resolved by marriage myths. And we can go on and on and on. The big one is culture versus nature. This is an idea that we are in nature and of culture. This might be something important for us to realize now as we face major ecological problems, including zoonotic disease and other kinds of issues related to ecological degradation. It's all related. So this is a very abstract theory, this structuralism, but very important. We see here now symbolic anthropology, very much involved in meaning systems. Probably one of the most significant writers in this realm would be Clifford Geertz. And I mentioned earlier his work on notions of interpretations of culture as a web of significances, culture as a web of significances, and this idea that we really don't understand a culture until we get into the symbols that people work with. Now, again, most important here is the idea that culture is a symbolic dynamic, and that these ideas that we hold are essential to our very, what you might say, functioning in the world. And all of this leads us to understanding that you could now, with Clifford Geertz, at this juncture in culture theory, the individual becomes more relevant, emerges in the analysis of culture, because you can see that culture now is, if you talk to one person, there's a very interesting book out there about the dreams and fantasies of one individual in Morocco, in which we can talk about an entire culture as suggestive of the ideas of this person that he holds, what ideas he has. Anyway, that is a ridiculously short version of what we might understand of symbolic interpretive anthropology. There are tremendous texts written on this. But, again, I'm leaving out a lot here. I've covered, for example, evolutionism. I skipped right over diffusionism. I kind of collapsed functionalism and separated it from structural functionalism. I gave you just a little bit on French structuralism, omitted ethno science. This is cultures described in terms of native categories. I am not giving any due here to feminist anthropology. The social relationship should be viewed as being gendered, very important. Sherry Ortner and others. Cultural materialism, we're not talking about. I don't have on this list. Marvin Harris, material conditions determine human consciousness and behavior. It's a one-liner for him. And then finally, we're ending with postmodernism. And here we have that human behavior stems from the way people perceive and classify their way, the world around them. I find that, we've moved through this postmodernism. They've questioned all other research. And basically, postmodernism is constructing a view that says grand theory of human behavior, of culture is dead. Belief in modernist scientific anthropology is somewhat arrogant to believe that they can describe, interpret, and give meaning to the lives of people from another culture. They don't really mean that you can't, but this is an idea that all accounts of culture are subjective. This guy, Roy Wagner, wrote a book called, I'm blanking on the title of the text, but it's basically an idea of culture as fiction, that what you see is what is funneled through your mind. Okay, so postmodernists, instead of looking for a collaborative, they are instead looking for a collaborative approach. Those living the culture are to be included in a study. You want their voice. You want to look at your biases. This is Wagner's idea of understanding that your perception of the other culture is coming through your lens. Very hard to get outside of your own culture entirely, and so through cultures are always changing and require interpretation, and so they're rejecting some generalization. Recently, I've been reading another text that's come out on anthropological theory. I guess it's the sort of 7th edition of this book by Worms that talks to postmodern theory, in some circles, a reemergence of evolutionary thought and culture and technology work of White. Some abandonment of postmodern theory is too negative, can't study anything. Some people say, if you follow that. The critics also say it's an intellectual fad that's come and gone. And now there might be really more of an eclectic outlook, where there's a bio-social cultural intersect, a more holistic, multi-layered theories. So people are opening up to understanding the good and the elements that you could pull from every one of these cultural ideas, and come up with another frame of discussion. Again, this is a thumbnail sketch of anthropological theory. I would be grossly misinforming you if I told you that I was giving you something of significant substance. This is just to get you familiar with some of the terminology as you encounter it in the textbook. Okay, so thank you for listening, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you.